So in this I'm going to set up a virtual network in Windows Azure and then actually use a site-to-site gateway to connect it to an on-premise network. So this is a basic Windows Azure subscription actually using MSDN rights. So the first thing I need to do is actually create a new virtual network. So go to Networks, create a virtual network, and we're going to give it a name. So I might call this Savtech, and then I'm going to use the 115 subnet, so I'm going to call it 115net. My affinity, I'm going to create a new affinity group. This is going to let me specify a location. So I'm going to create this in the East US. And for my affinity group, I'm going to call this Savtech 115. I can then specify DNS servers and VPN connectivity. So I'm going to skip the DNS servers for now. But what I do want is after this is to create a site-to-site VPN. So this is now asking me for a name for the address space on my local side. So what is my address space? So I might call this on-prem and on-prem net, and then it wants to know what is my VPN IP address. So I would go ahead and type in what is the public IP address for my on-premise network. And I tell it what is the IP address space for my on-premise. So I'm just going to connect it to one subnet effectively for this test. And it's just a single class C. And now I need to go ahead and actually configure what I want the IP address space to be actually within Windows Azure. So I actually don't want to use these defaults. So I'm going to change the address space that I'm going to use in Azure to a 115 instead, just for how I want to think about dividing up the IP network. So I'm going to change this to 10.7.115 and still 24. And what I'm going to do initially is I want to add a gateway subnet, but I want the gateway subnet to be at the start. So the first subnet I'm going to create is an infrastructure subnet, infranet. And what I'm going to do to force the way these get allocated, I'm going to start this at .9, and I'm only going to do this for 8 addresses. And then when I do the add gateway, notice it adds it at the start. Because for any subnet you create, you lose 2 IP addresses for sort of the gateway and then all ones, and then Azure reserves 3. So out of a /29, I only actually get 3 usable IP addresses, and the gateway needs 2. So it creates 2 gateway instances to support some redundancy. Now once I've done that, I'm going to add another subnet for my applications, so my SQL servers, anything else. And the idea of having that infrastructure net, it's only 3 IP addresses. I would have my domain controllers, so the DCs I want to add in the cloud, I would add in there. And so I'll give that 16 addresses, and you could go on, you could add additional ones. That's fine for what I need. So that's now actually going ahead and creating that network in Azure. So the network's now created. I can select it. I can look at my dashboard. And what I see is I currently don't have a gateway. What I can now do is actually, so I can do configuration from in here. So this is where I can actually go and add those DNS servers. So if I was going to add, for example, initially, I might want to point it to a DNS server running on premise once I've created this site-to-site gateway. Because the way this works is Azure gives out the IP addresses, and whatever DNS servers I put in here, it will give out as part of that kind of pseudo IP lease, even though it's an infinite lease until you deprovision the VM. But I'm just going to leave that for now, actually. So I go to dashboard, I'm going to say create that gateway. And this is where it will create a public IP address and give me the configuration script I need to actually go ahead and connect. So I'm going to say create gateway. And because I'm actually going to use the Windows Server 2012 routing remote access, I'm going to select dynamic routing. And yes, and that's going to go ahead, and it normally takes about 6 minutes. It's basically spinning up 2 PAS instances to host that gateway. So I'm going to let that finish. While that gateway is being created, I need to actually spin up my Windows Server 2012 routing remote access server. So while that's being created, I want to go and spin up the actual routing remote access server. So I've got Windows Server 2012 VM. It has 2 network adapters. One of them is configured with the public IP address, and the other just connects to the local network. So this is on that 10.7.173. So I just went into Server Manager, Manage Roles and Features, and the server role is remote access, and I'm just adding direct access and VPN and routing. So install that. And then also in my case, I actually went ahead and added a static route, so it actually knows how to route traffic internally. So for example, I could think of, I know for my 10.7.173 mask 255.255.255.0, I need to make sure I would go that, but I've added it already. So you would go ahead and you would add, if you needed to, any static routes to make sure this particular box knows how to route, so which network adapters it would go through, etc. And again, that's only because in this environment, this is a kind of pseudo virtual machine, but you may have to go and add static routes because the default route would have been configured for your external interface. So anything internal you need to set up that doesn't go through the default, you need to go and manually add routes for. So it's still creating the gateway. So the creation finished. It's now showing me the IP address it's allocated on the Azure side, the external access. So all I now need to do is actually go ahead and configure my local, my on-premise side. Remember, I passed it the IP address of my public side when I specified the configuration for the gateway. Rather than having to configure all that by scratch, I can actually say download a VPN device script. And it's going to let me select the type of device. So if you have a Cisco or Juniper, I can just give it details of the exact type and OS. It's going to actually give me the setup script. So for Microsoft, it's RRAS Windows Server 2012. And it's going to spit out the script that would actually then leverage. Let's do that again. And we'll save this. To location. And then if I actually open that file up that I just saved in Notepad, so this is it step by step. So you have to take all of this code and basically plug this in on your RRAS server. Notice it's filled in all the details for me. So as long as you wait for the gateway to get created, it's actually give you the complete script. It even fills out what is my Azure side IP subnet. It's giving it all the details of the IP address of the gateway. It's even got the shared secret, which is used for the communications between my on-prem. So all I basically have to do is take all of this and plug it in. So I've already actually configured this once before, but what would have changed would have been my shared secret. So I'm going to copy that. And then jump to my RRAS server. I have my PowerShell. So I have all of that script pasted in already. But I need to go and change that shared secret. And also what would have changed is this IP address. So notice I use the same subnet previously when I had this set up in the past, so that hasn't changed. So it recommends 100. But I would basically go through and just put in those correct values. So that's all done. So I'd have to install remote access. I've already done that. So I would run this line. So basically adds in that configuration. It's using IPsec, which is why I needed that shared key. So that's basically saying I need to restart. But I'm going to go ahead and set up some profile strings as part of this configuration. So the reason that's erroring is because I've not actually run through this script yet. So let's set this up. And it's defining some new functions. So run all of that. Now I can run these two. And these are included as part of that script that it gave you to run. Now they work. Now I'm going to restart the service. And at this point, I'm actually good to go. So eventually, this will try and it will just connect. Or I can actually trigger it. I can go ahead and force the connection. So on my local side again, I can actually say connect. And go and trigger that connection. And I can check the state. So currently that destination is disconnected. So it's connecting. And what I will see eventually is this will just go into a connected state. And it can actually take a couple of minutes for that to go through. So I actually see it's now showing connected. So if I go back to the Azure side, this doesn't refresh as frequently as you might hope. But if I refresh this again, it should now show as connected. Obviously on my local side it's showing I am connected. Okay, so it's still showing not. This, like I say, take a few minutes to actually get updated before it actually sees what is going on. So this is not a fantastic guidance on if you are or aren't connected. The best thing is you're on premise. I can look at that interface and this shows me I am connected. So what I should see though within a couple of minutes, the Windows Azure site should catch up and show me in a connected state. Okay, so it's given it long enough, it now actually shows connected. So it finally does match what PowerShell was already telling me. So that's good news. So now there is a site-to-site VPN connection between Windows Azure Network and my on-premise. So next thing would be to actually test this. Now right now I don't have any virtual machines actually connected to this network. But the first thing I am going to go ahead and do is configure in the DNS server. So I'm going to actually configure it with my on-premise domain controller 10.7. So what will happen is when IP addresses are given to virtual machines created connection to this network, it will configure them with this DNS. So I might do this initially when I want to create my first DC in Azure so it can actually communicate with my on-premise DC. And then once that DC is up and created, I would change this configuration to primarily point to my Windows Azure domain controller, and then maybe my on-prem as secondary. I'd want to make sure obviously my Active Directory was configured with a separate site for my Windows Azure subnet. So that 10.7.115, I would actually go ahead and in my Active Directory create as a separate site. So actually I can jump over to that, and if I spin up my Active Directory sites and services tool on this machine, you can actually see I've went ahead and did that already. So I actually have an Azure site configured over here, which is the subnet I've configured in Azure. So I'm actually all set up and ready to do that. So the next thing is actually just go ahead and create a virtual machine. So I'm going to go to, save that first. And you can only have so many DNS servers in your entire Azure subscription. I think it's 9. So if you had lots of different subnets and networks in your Azure, you are limited to 9 DNS servers in total. So I go to my virtual machines. I'm going to go and create a new virtual machine from the gallery. And I'm just going to go ahead and create a 2012 data center one. You can say which patch level you want. I'm going to give it a virtual machine name. So maybe this is going to be an Azure DC01. Give it a size. Local John. I'm going to create a new cloud service. And my cloud service for this might be my, I don't want to call it the name of that VM because I'm going to create multiple VMs in here. But maybe it's subnet, Azure, and maybe all of these are going to be tied to that 115. And I can say, well, what affinity group? So I actually do want to use that network I created. And then I can say, well, which virtual network do I want to connect it to? This is going to be one of my domain controllers. So I'm going to say that infrastructure network. So it gets one of those first set of IP addresses. If it was a SQL box, a file server, I would select the app network. I'm going to select that infrastructure network. I can say a storage account, so I can do an automatically generated, or I could use that existing one. If I was going to create multiple domain controllers up in the cloud, I would create an availability set to make sure those 2 DCs in the cloud don't get put in the same rack, the same fault domain. But I'm only going to create one in this instance, so I can just say no availability set. I don't need any special additional ports opened up, so I'm just going to go ahead and create that. And I'm not actually going to go and promote this, but what I will do once this is actually created is actually go ahead and show the IP address it gets and prove I can do communication between on-prem and Windows Azure. Now, the only other change I may specifically have to make is on-premise. Let's clear this out. If that RRAS box was not my default gateway, then there's no way for my other on-premise virtual machines to know how to get to that 115 subnet I created in Azure. So what I actually have to do is create a specific route to get to Azure. Now I manually did this. So you notice up here this route. This shows me to get to the 10.7.115 network, I have to go gateway 10.7.173.2, which is the IP address I gave to the RRAS server, remember, on premise. So I manually configured the routing to be able to get to Azure. Now I would have to do this on every single VM that wanted to tweak to Azure unless I updated my main routers, which would obviously what you'd want to do in a production environment. I just didn't have that option for this lab. So to enable them to actually talk to the Azure VMs, I had to tell it basically which way to go. So I'm going to let this finish and then we'll come back to it. So that virtual machine is now created. I can select it. I can see it's our internal IP address. Notice it did get an IP address from that infrastructure virtual subnet I created. And at this point, I probably just want to connect to it. So I'm just going to say connect. It's going to download me a special RDP file. So let me go ahead and connect to that box. So it's connecting through. So it's logging on for the first time. It's going to take a second. Okay, so now I'm going to launch PowerShell. Now on this box, if I do an ipconfig/all, I'll actually see that it did get that IP address of my DNS server it's actually using this internal. If I do an NS lookup for an on-premise, it should actually go back over the cloud, and notice it, after timing out, it did actually get me that record. So it correctly returned the result. I should also now be able to actually ping my on-premise server, and if I configure the firewall on this side, so let me jump over to the on-premise resource. So if I try and ping, I think it was 12, I would actually expect this to fail initially. Because its rule, so you can see it is 10.7.115.12, but it hasn't actually got the firewall exception enabled. So if I actually launch that and configure the firewall, that should then work. So I'm just going to open up the firewall configuration, settings, control panel. Let's go to advanced. I'm going to turn on the echo request. So now if I actually jump back and try this again, it now works. Now it's fairly high latency, because obviously this is coming from on-prem out into Windows Azure, but it now proves I have that site-to-site connectivity. So any machines I have on my on-premise 10.7.173 can now talk to any of the machines in Azure on 10.7.115 and vice versa. So that's it. DNS resolution works. I would now go ahead and configure all the other services I may need. So I mean, if I'm jumping back over here, for example, I could do an NS lookup on my, I could join it to the domain. I would make this a DC, and then once I actually made this a DC, so now I actually resolved my SQL server, so all of that is functioning. So I'd promote this to a DC, and once that was a DC, I would then go ahead and change the configuration of my virtual network to point to that on-premise, the Azure, so 10.7.115.12, and then have my on-prem one as maybe a secondary. And that's it. That's configuring site-to-site connectivity between Windows Azure and your on-premise. Thank you.